In the year 921 CE, a young diplomat and religious scholar named Ahmad ibn Fadlan ibn al-Abbas ibn Rashid ibn Hamad prepared for what would become one of the most extraordinary journeys of the medieval Islamic world. He served the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir in Baghdad, the glittering capital of the Islamic Empire, where minarets pierced the sky and scholars from across the known world gathered in pursuit of knowledge. The story began not with Ibn Fadlan's own ambitions, but with a distant plea for help. Far to the north, beyond the Caspian Sea and the endless steppes, the ruler of the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had established a kingdom along the great Volga River, sent an embassy to Baghdad. This ruler, whose name was Almish ibn Shilki Yiltawar, had recently converted to Islam and now sought assistance from the caliph. He requested teachers who could instruct his people in Islamic law, craftsmen who could build a mosque and fortress, and most importantly, support in his conflicts with the neighboring Khazars, a powerful Turkic people whose elite had converted to Judaism. The Caliph al-Muqtadir, sensing both political opportunity and religious duty, assembled an embassy to answer this call. Ahmad ibn Fadlan was appointed as the official legal expert and secretary of the mission. He would be the one to record the journey, to observe and document everything they encountered in these distant lands that few Muslims had ever seen. The embassy departed Baghdad on June 21, 921 CE. Ibn Fadlan traveled with several companions, including the official ambassador Sausan al-Rasi, who represented the caliph directly. They carried with them gifts, money to help build the fortress and mosque, and the caliph's official response to Almish's requests. The journey northward was arduous beyond measure. They traveled through the familiar territories of Persia first, passing through cities and towns where Arabic was spoken and minarets called the faithful to prayer. But soon they entered stranger lands. They crossed into the territory of the Oghuz Turks, nomadic peoples whose camps dotted the grasslands like temporary cities of felt tents. Ibn Fadlan observed these people carefully, noting their customs, their diet of mutton and horse meat, and their fierce independence. The embassy pressed on through the winter, enduring bitter cold that Ibn Fadlan, raised in the temperate climate of Baghdad, found almost unbearable. They crossed frozen rivers and traversed endless steppes where the wind cut like knives. The journey took them through the lands of various Turkic peoples, the Pechenegs, the Bashkirs, and others, each with their own customs and ways of life that Ibn Fadlan meticulously recorded. After nearly a year of travel, covering thousands of miles, the embassy finally reached the land of the Volga Bulgars in May 922 CE. King Almish received them with great ceremony, and Ibn Fadlan and his companions set about their assigned tasks, teaching Islamic law and helping to organize the religious life of this newly converted kingdom. But it was here, in this distant northern land, that Ibn Fadlan encountered the people who would make his account famous for centuries to come: the Rus. The Rus were Scandinavian traders and warriors, Vikings from Sweden who had established trading routes deep into Eastern Europe and Central Asia. They had settled along the river systems, using the great waterways as highways for commerce. These particular Rus had come to the Volga region as merchants, traveling in their distinctive ships to trade with the Volga Bulgars and other peoples of the region. Ibn Fadlan's first sight of these northern warriors must have been startling. He described them as the most physically impressive people he had ever seen. Tall as palm trees, he wrote, with ruddy complexions and blonde or reddish hair. They were merchants who had come bearing furs, amber, and slaves to trade for silver, silk, and other goods from the Islamic world and beyond. What followed was Ibn Fadlan's detailed ethnographic observation of these strange foreigners. He watched them arrive in their ships on the Volga River, vessels that they pulled up onto the shore. Each merchant, he observed, came with young slave women whom they intended to sell, and these women accompanied them throughout their stay. The Rus warriors, Ibn Fadlan noted with a mixture of fascination and disgust, were shockingly unclean by Islamic standards of hygiene. Each morning, he observed, a slave girl would bring a basin of water. The merchant would wash his hands and face in it, then comb his hair, blow his nose, and spit into the same water. When he was finished, the slave girl would take the basin to the next man, who would do the same, and so on, with all the men in a group using the same water in succession. For Ibn Fadlan, accustomed to the elaborate ablutions required by Islamic law, this communal washing was deeply unsanitary. Yet he also observed their religious devotion, not to Allah, but to their own pagan gods. When the Rus merchants arrived to trade, they would first visit tall wooden posts erected near the riverbank. These posts were carved with faces, and the largest among them represented what Ibn Fadlan understood to be their chief god. The merchants would bring bread, meat, onions, milk, and alcohol as offerings, prostrating themselves before these idols and praying for successful trade. "O my lord," Ibn Fadlan heard them say, "I have come from a far land with so many slave girls and so many sable furs." And then they would enumerate their goods, asking the god to send them a merchant with many silver coins who would buy their merchandise without haggling. Ibn Fadlan observed their daily life with the keen eye of an anthropologist before such a discipline existed. He noted that each man carried an axe, a sword, and a long knife at all times. The swords, he wrote with admiration, were of Frankish make, the finest blades in the world at that time, forged in the workshops of Western Europe and traded across vast distances. The Rus men tattooed their bodies from fingertip to neck with dark green designs of trees and figures. The Rus wore distinctive clothing, Ibn Fadlan recorded, tunics that left one arm bare to allow freedom of movement, and each man, rich or poor, wore a cloak fastened with a brooch. The wealthy among them wore fine garments and adorned their women with elaborate jewelry. He described how Rus women wore neck rings of gold or silver, with each ring representing 10,000 silver dirhams in value. Thus, a wealthy woman might wear multiple rings as a display of her husband's wealth. But it was a funeral that provided Ibn Fadlan with his most famous and disturbing observations. News came that a great chieftain among the Rus had died, and Ibn Fadlan, ever the curious scholar, sought to witness their funeral customs. The Rus, he learned, placed their dead leader in a temporary grave for 10 days while they prepared for the elaborate ceremony. They gathered the dead man's possessions, his clothing, gold, weapons, and other goods, and divided them into 3 parts: 1/3 for his family, 1/3 to pay for the funeral garments they would make, and 1/3 to purchase alcohol for the funeral feast. The Rus selected a young slave girl to accompany their chieftain to the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan learned that when someone of importance died, the dead man's family would ask his slave girls and servants, "Who among you will die with him?" This was considered a great honor, and once someone volunteered, they could not change their mind. In this case, one of the slave girls had agreed. The Rus dragged their chieftain's ship onto the shore and propped it up with wooden supports. They placed a couch inside, covered with cushions and fabrics. An old woman whom they called the Angel of Death supervised the preparations, a woman Ibn Fadlan described as a massive, grim figure. They exhumed the dead chieftain from his temporary grave and dressed him in fine garments, trousers, boots, a tunic, and a caftan of brocade with gold buttons. They placed a cap of brocade and fur on his head. They carried him into the ship and seated him on the cushions, propping him up. Around him they placed all manner of goods: fruits, aromatic plants, bread, meat, and onions. They brought his weapons and placed them beside him. They sacrificed a dog, cutting it in 2 and throwing it into the ship. They sacrificed 2 horses, cutting them up and throwing the meat inside. They sacrificed 2 cows and a rooster and hen. During these 10 days, the slave girl who had volunteered to die with the chieftain was treated with great honor, though she was watched constantly. She was given alcohol to drink and sang songs of farewell, Ibn Fadlan understood. She visited each of the Rus tents, and the master of each tent had intercourse with her, saying, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." On the day of the funeral, Ibn Fadlan witnessed the final, terrible ceremony. The girl drank cup after cup of alcohol while singing. The Angel of Death and other women led her to a structure that had been erected near the ship. 6 men entered with her. All of them had intercourse with her. Then they laid her beside her dead master and held her down. The Angel of Death wrapped a rope around her neck and gave the ends to 2 men to pull, while she herself stabbed the girl repeatedly with a dagger. The dead chieftain's closest kinsman then appeared, naked, walking backward toward the ship. He held a piece of burning wood, with which he set fire to the wood piled under the ship. Others came with burning brands, and soon the ship, the dead chieftain, the sacrificed girl, and all the possessions were engulfed in flames. A Rus man standing near Ibn Fadlan saw the shocked expression on the Arab's face. Through an interpreter, he said, "You Arabs are fools." When Ibn Fadlan asked why, the man explained, "You take the people who are most dear to you and whom you honor most, and put them in the dirt where insects and worms devour them. We burn them in a moment, so that they enter paradise at once." Ibn Fadlan recorded this exchange without further comment, allowing the stark difference in worldviews to speak for itself. The Rus believed, Ibn Fadlan learned, that the stronger and faster the fire burned, the more honored the dead person was by their gods, and the quicker their soul would reach paradise. Indeed, within an hour, the ship, the chieftain, the girl, and everything else had been reduced to ash. Ibn Fadlan's account continued with other observations of the Rus and the peoples of the Volga region, but his testimony of this funeral ceremony would become one of the most detailed and controversial ethnographic descriptions from the medieval world. Modern scholars debate how accurately Ibn Fadlan understood what he witnessed, how much his Islamic perspective colored his interpretation, how much was lost in translation through interpreters, and whether some details might have been embellished. But his account remains the only contemporary description by an educated outside observer of Viking funeral practices in the East. Ibn Fadlan eventually completed his mission and returned to Baghdad, though the exact date of his return is unknown. His report to the Caliph, titled Risala, account, survived through later copies and quotations by other medieval authors. For over 1,000 years, his encounter with the Rus warriors on the banks of the Volga River has provided a window into the medieval world, a moment when the Islamic civilization at its height encountered the Vikings at the edge of their far-flung trading networks, and one careful observer recorded what he saw with honesty, detail, and an ethnographer's instinct for the telling particular. The larger phenomenon of Scandinavian expansion during the Viking Age. While their cousins in the west raided England, Ireland, and France, these eastern Vikings, called Rus, from which the name Russia eventually derives, established trading routes through the river systems of Eastern Europe, founding cities like Novgorod and Kiev, and reaching as far as Constantinople and the Caspian Sea. Ibn Fadlan's account captures them at a moment when East met North, when the cosmopolitan Islamic world encountered the pagan warriors of Scandinavia, and when both cultures looked at each other with a mixture of fascination and horror at their profound differences.